All right, aloha and welcome to today's National ANA webinar. Today is May 28th, 2015, and you're here for the Learning from and Building on Short and Long-Term Outcomes Throughout the Life of the Project and Beyond webinar, presented by the Administration for Native Americans. ANA, or the Administration for Native Americans, is a U.S. federal agency that promotes self-sufficiency for Native Americans and Pacific Islanders by providing discretionary grant funding for community-based projects and training and technical assistance to eligible tribes and Native organizations. And ANA's vision statement is that all Native communities are thriving, and so they'll be working hard until that is accomplished. And you can learn more about ANA by visiting their website, listed there on the screen, http://www.acf.hhs.gov/programs/ANA. So today's webinar is one of many that ANA offers. So twice a month, ANA offers some type of webinar that will help you to carry out a community-based project to serve your Native communities. Today's webinar is the last for the month of May. Next month in June, on June 11th, we have a webinar on conducting a community readiness assessment. And this will be presented by the ANA Western region. You can sign up for that webinar at the Western Region website, www.anawestern.org, or you can visit the events page of the ANA website, which would be their website /events. And on their website, you'll also be able to find recordings of past webinars. So all of our past webinars have been recorded for you to search through and watch on your own time. And that would be available on the resource library section of the ANA website, and which is also where you'll be able to find this webinar. Today's webinar is being presented by the Pacific Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. Our website is there, www.anapacificbasin.org, and we are really here to provide nonprofit training to all of our community serving organizations here in the Pacific, as well as technical assistance to anyone who needs help serving their community. So if you need any help, please contact us. Today's presenter is actually the regional director of the Pacific Region TTA Center. His name is Keone Nunez, and in addition to being our region's director, he's also a practitioner of Native Hawaiian tattooing, which you see there on the screen. But today he's going to be teaching us about project outcomes and how we can use that to improve our projects. And so at this point, I'll pass it off to Mr. Nunez.
Aloha kaua. Thanks, Matt. And for this webinar, we're going to have some goals that we want to achieve. And the first goal that we want to look at is start working towards the development of short and long-term outcomes. Now, I know that some of you have already developed long and short-term outcomes for your projects and for your programs, and that's really good. But there are many other type of outcomes that can be looked at, and so this is just to be able to start working towards the development of those. And the second goal is to prepare for impact evaluation visits. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as the webinar goes on. The first thing we need to look at is what are outcomes. The vernacular, the words that are used in dealing with development of projects and such might be a little bit different than what is normally used. So, in our purpose, outcomes are milestones that lead towards the achievement of the project goal. Well, they help towards that, yeah. And they're either product or achievement based. So it could be a product or an outcome could be something that was done and done well, hopefully. And it should work hand in hand with objectives. And that's really important. So you need to understand uh, the way that the objectives, the outcomes, the problem statement, and the goals work hand in hand with each other. So this should work with the objectives, and the objectives, of course, work towards the completion of the goal, and the completion of the goal, of course, work towards the elimination of the problem. Okay, internal measures that lead towards organizational success and capacity to serve community. Now, oftentimes when we look at outcomes, we're looking at some of the outcomes of the project. When we talk about internal measures, we're looking at some of the outcomes that have a definite impact on your program. Now, the difference between your program and your project is your program is the overall program, of which you can have many, many projects under that program. So, this is the internal measure that leads towards the organizational success. And it should be reflective of the community that you serve. And I think a lot of times organizations start off very, very community based. Then some organizations wander off and become more involved with their own success and lose sight of the community that is being serviced. I think it's really essential that when you're looking at organizational short and long term outcomes, to really base it off what is necessary for the success not only of your organization, but of your community. Because if your community is successful, then your organization would be successful. Your outcomes should fit with the mission of the organization. You shouldn't have an outcome that does not have anything to do with the mission of your organization because it doesn't help for the solid establishment and continuation of your organization. So it should fit within the mission of your organization. I know some of these things should be self evident, but sometimes it's nice to hear it from another voice. Okay, what's the difference between long and short term outcomes? And we're going to look at these. A short term outcome is generally achieved in a few months within a project period for 1 to 5 year project. And so that's typical for short term outcomes. And examples include the development of a curriculum, and this is a project outcome. The hiring of project staff, again, project outcome. Completion of project activity, again, another project outcome. An organizational retreat, which is more programmatic but also has implications towards the project that is being fulfilled at the moment. Long term outcomes are generally focused on continuation of a project and or achievement of a community goal. Okay, the reason why it's and or is because sometimes the projects will end, and sometimes the project themselves are short-term outcomes. Yeah, so that's why it's either or. Um, Examples include development of a sustainability plan program, creation of personnel policies and procedures, again, program, personnel policies and procedures, again, programmatic, yeah, and implementation of a curriculum that's project specific, and financial stability of project beneficiaries. Again, that's project specific. Now, one thing that you might have noticed between the short term outcomes and the long term outcomes is that with the short term outcomes, the majority of what you see is project focused with some program focus within that. Within the long term outcomes, you'll see that the majority are program focused and some implications into the projects. So that really is how it should work. A lot of the long term outcomes are really focused on the continuation um, of the organizational's ability to achieve the community goal. Whether or not that includes a project, that really is dependent on the project that you're doing. Now, developing outcomes, and there are some things that are different between short term outcomes and long term outcomes. One of the things in developing short term outcomes is that you have to look at what are the urgent needs of the community that needs to be addressed. That is really important because, again, this is the urgent need. Now, in many communities, there are many, many, many different urgent needs. And all of those things are important, but you don't want to spread yourself too thin. And so when you're developing short-term outcomes, please try and focus in one or more of those needs that has to be addressed. And so you have that. Once you get an idea of these urgent needs, you're going to have to look at what are the resources necessary to address these needs. How can you bring together the things necessary in order to address these needs? And what are the human resources, the financial resources, the community resources? From that, you can start looking at what your outcome should be. Okay? For some organizations, the outcome should be the development of uh, a language curriculum. For others, it might be the development of financial policies and procedures for the beneficiaries. Another one could be financial literacy, developing um, a curriculum for financial literacy that is culturally based or something of that nature. Yeah. So, what are the urgent needs to be addressed, and what are the resources necessary to address these needs? The next is again long term outcomes, and the focus is slightly different. Okay. What are the overall community goals that you want to address? What community goal uh, do you feel your organization can adequately address with the organization's missions? Yeah. You have to look at some of the milestones necessary to achieve these goals. What are some of the things that you think has to be done or a good indication of the progress towards achieving these goals? Yeah. You have to make sure that these outcomes are in line with the organization's mission. Yeah. And again, the same as before, what resources are necessary to achieve these long term outcomes? And so that's how you start looking and thinking of how you develop these outcomes. Now, we're not going to tell you that there's a formula to this. These are some of the things necessary to actually contemplate as you're doing the work. And for each organization, for each community, there's slightly different methods of achieving these things. There's slightly different outcomes that you need. Yeah, so I think that it's really important for you guys to gain these tools that will allow you to develop these outcomes in a way that will be digestible, not only for your organization, but for your community also. Okay, once you develop outcomes, you need to have some sort of accountability. Um, Oftentimes, there are many very good ideas and very good outcomes that were listed in organizational plans. Without any accountability, you cannot have a really solid program. And so, with a, outcome accountability, first thing you got to do is be real honest with your achievements and challenges. And some people think that if you list too many challenges, then it will um, deflate your project or your program. And that's pretty much not true. If there are a lot of challenges, it's a reflection on the community that you work in. It might be a reflection on your organization also. If the challenges come through organizational challenges, then you have to reevaluate things. But we're going to talk about that in a little bit too. And so you need to be very honest with your achievements and your challenges. I mean, really celebrate your achievements and really acknowledge and figure out ways to overcome your challenges. Yeah. You have to keep good records of participants, their attendance, their work, and their volunteer hours. And that's something that a lot of people don't really take into account is that, well, if we're looking at our outcomes, what does it mean tell to say that, you know, the participants came 30% of the time or 60% of the time or 90% of the time? uh, that speaks to the accountability because if you have um, 10 people enrolled in your project and uh, you have attendance of 3 and they all pass the final test or final exam, just because 100% of your attendance or attendees um, passed with 100%, that speaks to the success of the project for those who attended. But what happened to the others that didn't attend? What happened to them? Why did they not attend? What was it within that activity that caused them to drop out? Those type of things needs to be looked at to be honest about what your project is being able to do. Outcomes may change throughout the project, and that's really important also to understand. You have to reevaluate things regularly. I mean, to be real honest, there are very few projects that go on as envisioned throughout the life of the project without any hitches. There are always things that come up. So you need to reevaluate things. So the outcomes may change throughout the project. You might think that, you know what, one of the outcomes that we wanted was uh, to have people go through a process where they can um, open their own savings accounts. You know, maybe what's necessary before that is simply financial literacy, because they're not ready to open an account yet. So you might have to reassess that. You reevaluate things, and the outcomes change from opening an account to gaining financial literacy experience or courses. Yeah. You need to develop evaluation tools, and um, for many communities, the evaluation tools that are out there do not speak to our communities. And so we need to develop these evaluation tools. And don't be afraid of that. And those type of evaluation tools can help not only your organization and community, but it can help other communities that might be in a similar situation. Yeah. And just realize that you can tweak what you do when necessary. Don't think that everything is written in stone. So even though you might have thought that this outcome is going to be the best for your project and for your community, halfway down the line, um, you find out that there is some other things that needs to go on before the successful completion of this outcome. You can tweak it. Don't hold it on a hard line, because if you do so, then your project might fail. And that's really important to understand. This is one way of doing evaluation, and this is how you strengthen your organization or program through ongoing evaluations. Yeah. The PDCA process is uh, is one process of doing it, and the P stands for planning, or the D stands for do, the C stands for check, and the A stands for act. Okay. We have a question from Chadwick from Pai Foundation. Where do we account for these changes? Because in the semi-annual OPR, there is no section to change or to alter the outcomes. The way you account for these changes is by working with your program manager, your program specialist, I should say, on the ANA level. Work with them. Um, if you feel that your outcome needs to change, then make your program specialist aware of these things, and uh, then you might need to do a different OWP objective plan. I know that sounds like a lot of work. Oftentimes, it's just one or two activities that needs to be changed within the OWP, as long as it's working to the same objective. Yeah. So I think that the first thing you should do is call your program specialist and say, hey, you know what? Um, we're realizing that one of the outcomes that we originally thought we would like to achieve is needs to be tweaked in one way or another. And so, how can we best work with you to make sure that this is done and reflective within our project and within our OPR in the future? So, that's the simplest way of doing it. Yeah. So, we're going to go through this process of PDCA. Okay, it helps you, this PDCA process helps you to continually change and tweak what you do in order to achieve high quality in your results and processes, to gain continual increases in work efficiency. And it also allows you to clearly see which stage a project is at. And that's really, really important. Yeah. You have to take an objective look towards it too, though. It assists you in handling your work logically and systematically. Yeah. Okay. The first step is identify what is that you want to improve. And you have to take the time out to evaluate what's going on with the project, what's going on with activity, what's going on with um, your objectives, and figure out what it is that you need to improve. And sometimes this identification process can be fairly long, and sometimes you might choose something totally different than what is the reality, but it is important that you identify what you want to improve. You have to identify um, the procedures within the organization and program to actually changing the problem. Yeah, and so the procedures might be off. It might be something very simple as far as maybe within your organization, someone needs to report to a supervisor before actually doing the activities, and so it could be something as simple as that. But you need to identify the procedures in order um, to change the problems. Yeah. You have to start prioritizing the problems that need solving. Now, for some people, people get really overwhelmed with this process because there might be so many problems that needs to be addressed. But you have to start prioritizing. You have to start somewhere, and you have to start where it can make the most impact. In whatever way. It might not be the one that is the most glorified uh, need, but you have to get to that before. It could be a very, very minor need, but you have to get to that before you get to the bigger, more glorified need. Yeah. And you have to develop an action plan. You have to look and realistically understand what are the steps necessary to actually go ahead and address this. Yeah. That comes to step two. After you do that, you start implementing on a small scale as a test. After you start prioritizing, after you figure out how you're going to do it, after you develop your action plan, then you just start on a small scale because you want to make sure that it's successful, that it doesn't blow up in your face. So start on a small scale as a test. Then afterwards, you can execute the action plan to the fullest if it turns out right. If you implement on a small scale and it is not successful, then you go back to the planning process. You go back and you figure out why wasn't it successful? What are some of the challenges that came up that we need to address? Yeah. Uh, if it is successful, then you execute the action plan, the entire action plan. Within that process, collect data and document problems. This is really essential because it will help you with any future uh, tweaking of your outcomes. Step three, you check, you measure the effectiveness, you evaluate information and or data, all the evaluation that you collected before. You kind of evaluate whether the information or data was pertinent to what the problems were. So you need to really have a very objective perspective on this. And then you modify to make more effective if necessary. Sometimes it's not necessary, sometimes it is. Sometimes, this often happens when people cook. Um, they're they start tasting the food, and they say, hey, we got to tweak it a little bit more. This is really good, but we got to tweak it a little bit more to make it better. And that's what is done here. You modify to make it more effective if it's necessary. Okay, then after that is step four, and that's act. Okay, you adopt, adapt, or abandon. There's nothing wrong with abandoning something that doesn't work. In fact, if you don't have that mentality, if it doesn't work and you don't abandon it, you might pull down everyone else with you, around that project. So you have to adopt, adapt, or abandon. And sometimes that's really hard because for many of us who work within this field, we are emotionally attached to the things that happen within this field. And especially if you're running a project that you feel is something that the community needs, and all of a sudden you don't get the results that you want. In fact, the results are really, really miserable. You might have to think about just letting go and abandoning that process. And that's a hard thing for everyone who works in this field. Okay. Loop back to the planning stage if necessary. This is that why you see in the graphic that everything is cyclical, um, because it doesn't mean that right after you do the check and the act part that it stops. You might have to loop back to the planning stage. Yeah, continue to find more effective ways of doing things. Okay, even though you might have solved the problem that stood between you and this outcome, doesn't mean that it's the best way of doing things. Things can be done better sometimes, and um, be open to finding more effective ways. Yeah, and again, you have to identify and prioritize things. And again, this is something that is really, really difficult sometimes to achieve because, like I said, everyone has passion about the work that you guys do in your own programs and within your communities. And so sometimes it's hard to objectively identify and prioritize. This is one of the hardest things to do. Again, this is necessary in order to do a very good evaluation of what is going on, um, in your project, in your activity, to successfully produce an outcome that will be good for your community and your organization. Hey, one thing that a lot of people don't want to talk about too much is budget evaluation, because sometimes budgets are um, is the the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room because people understand that budgets can be very, very emotional and can be personal, and it shouldn't be. Um, so you have to look at budget evaluation. You have to develop your program financial procedures, and not um, just uh, say that, oh, you know what, I'm going to write you a check and you can go ahead and purchase the things that you need to, um, because sometimes that purchase isn't what is really needed. So you have to develop a program financial procedure that trickles down to your projects. Yeah. So make sure that that is developed within your organization. You make sure that the budget is aligned with activities. Um, One of the things that a lot of people fail to realize is that the monies that are given to you are, even though it's not stated as such, it's already allocated to certain things. And you need to make sure that the budget is allocated, is aligned with activities that it's supposed to be um, aligned with. And the government doesn't give you monies and say, well, you need to spend so much for this, so much for that, so much for that. No, they leave it up to you, but you have to take that extra step and make sure that it's aligned with your activities. And when I say align with activities, it's not just activities per se, it's with the personnel that goes along with the activities, with the materials that is necessary for the activities, with the support services that is necessary with those activities. So it's not just like if you're writing a curriculum, um, you need to have personnel that would support those things, and that's aligned with that activity. Yeah. The budget is built to achieve project objectives. You need to start looking at that and make sure that the budget, like how I just broke down, is built to achieve your project objective, because your project objective is what you're working towards. Yeah. Is the budget reflective of the project outcomes? Now, if you have two or three short-term outcomes, is the budget reflective of this? Does it show that it is money well spent in producing these outcomes? Yeah, and that's really important. What happens when the budget needs adjustment? Several things. You can use the PDCA process, and it can be applied to the budget. Excuse me. And the process should be in line with the organization's procedures. Again, the process needs to be in line with your um, financial procedures, and sometimes with your personnel procedures. So the process should be in line with your organization's procedures. You submit whatever budget modification to the program manager or program specialist, yeah, that you have. Now, this is important because um, the circulars were recently passed, went into effect mid-December of last year. Now, prior to this super circular, it was okay for you to move 25% of your monies within that year around in your budget without necessarily needing your uh, program specialist approval. Of course, you should always let your program specialist know that you're going to move around money. Okay, so prior to and in your they might have questions. Uh, can you hear me now? Oh, okay. Let me know if there's uh, some issues around that. Again, after the super circulars were passed, you can only move 10% of your budget uh, within the budget, 10% of your the finance within your budget without a budget modification. Now, it's always good to let your program specialist know that you're doing this, even though you're not required to. It's always good to let them know because it is important for them to know what you're doing because that way if they don't know what you're doing, they might question it later on. And so that's why it's really important for you to do that, um, even though you're not required to do a budget modification. Okay. But when you are going over that 10%, then you should submit a budget modification. And within the budget modification, it's not just a line item budget, but you need to also do a budget justification for that too. Okay. And that might require you changing your 454 and um, if the amounts are different, but 424, excuse me, 424 and 424A. Yeah. So you have to, that's why it's good to work with your program specialist on that to see whether or not you need to do all of that. You might have to do, again, with your budget modification of over 10%, then you might have to submit all of those things, but talk to your program specialist first. Okay, all of what we've been talking about is really important for you to include with your impact evaluation. So, what happens at ANA impact evaluation and at your end of the ANA project? Um, First of all, the impact evaluations are not punitive. A lot of people get really, really, really nervous when they get the letter saying that we're going to do an impact evaluation on your project. Um, it's not punitive. They just want to see what impact you have had within your community. And oftentimes, it's all the time, impact evaluations are on the last year of your project. And so they want to see what impacts have occurred. What are some of the outcomes that have occurred that would impact your community? And oftentimes, your short-term outcomes might turn into long-term outcomes. Your short-term outcomes, say the development of a curriculum, might turn into a long-term outcome by the implementation of that curriculum. So, those are some of the things that is necessary for them to see as far as the success of your project. So, like I said, it's not punitive. They just want to see, and it really wants to see what your project has been doing. And that's really good. That's good for the community, it's good for the organization. And so, one of the things that you need to do is to get all of the things that we talked about earlier. Look at your short-term outcomes. Gather all the information from that, and um, do the things that are necessary for you to really give a good look at what happened. Okay, so some of the things is that what are some of the successes in the activities? Uh, and it's really sometimes as Native people, we have a hard time saying how good we did things. And that's pretty normal, you know. Whenever people ask me to write a bio of myself, I have a really hard time. I actually ask friends of mine to do it. And sometimes that might be good. What are some successes if you can't, if you feel uncomfortable doing something like that? Ask your community members, what are some successes that you see in the activities that we have accomplished? Yeah. And what are some challenges? Challenges are almost well, they're more important in my opinion than successes, in my opinion. And opinions differ. The reason why it's more important is because then we know where we need to do work. Yeah. Um, And so some of these challenges uh, need attention right away. And so, did you make the necessary adjustments? And what were they, and what were the outcomes of that? And so, all of these things are really important, yeah, to include. What are some of the challenges? Yeah, we had a lot of challenges. One of the challenges might have been that there was a hurricane or typhoon that came through us. And did we make adjustments? Yeah, we instead of having indoor classes or outdoor classes, we had indoor classes. Things of that nature. And how did it impact the participants? How did these challenges impact the participants? And so it's really important to have those type of things uh, ready for your impact evaluation. Yeah. With objectives, what were some challenges in fulfilling the objectives? Now, for a lot of people, you might have had challenges in activities, but it didn't affect the outcome in the objectives. But for some, it does. And so, what are some of the challenges that fulfill objectives? How did you address them to reach project success? And how did that impact participants? Yeah. And again, with the budget, what were some challenges with the budget? Did you need to make adjustments? And what were they, and what were their outcomes? And how did that impact the participants? These are all things that, if you looked at the beginning of our webinar, many of these things would have addressed all of these things. Yeah. So that's why it worked hand in hand. Yeah. The outcomes. Are the long term outcomes realistic? And sometimes you really don't know whether or not your long-term outcomes are realistic unless until the end of the project, because then you can evaluate whether or not you have successfully uh, come to terms with your short-term outcomes, and you can be a little bit more realistic with your long-term outcomes. And for some of your projects, you might need to tweak it, but for others, it's very, very realistic and very doable. What were some of the challenges? Again, with your outcomes, did you need to make any adjustments? And what were they? And what were the outcomes? And how did it impact your participants? Again, these questions might be redundant in your mind, but all of these are questions that hit at a different level for different things. Okay, when you're preparing for your impact evaluation, make sure that your organization's procedures, both your policies and personnel procedures and um, financial procedures, are up to date. And make sure that they reflect both the program and the project. That's why um, it's much, much more easier to enfold the project procedures into program procedures than to adjust the program procedures to fulfill the project's procedures. That's kind of much more difficult. Yeah. So make sure that your all of your personnel policies and procedures and your financial policies and procedures are up to date and reflect both the program and project. I cannot emphasize this uh, more because um, oftentimes the health and success of, of a program uh, is traced back to their policies and procedures, both personnel and financial. Make sure that the project participants, community members, and staff share their project experiences with the evaluation team. And that's really important because, um, you as maybe project director or um, program executive director, you might have one perception of what's going on. You might think that this project is a total disaster. But the participants, the community members and staff thinks that it's wonderful. And so it's really necessary for you to start looking at these policies, these participants and community members as an active part of your evaluation. And again, sometimes they can sing praises of the project much better than you can as personnel. So I think that those are some things that are really, really important to get together with your impact evaluation visit. And again, it is not punitive. They just want to see what kind of impact your project it has had on the community and what kind of impact it's going to have in the future and beyond, you know, for as long as it continues. Yeah. And so that's the important thing of getting these impact evaluations out. Okay. Okay. We're coming up almost to an hour, and we'd like to allow the time that we have for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, just type it in um, into the chat box. Auntie Verlian, can you just elaborate on that a little bit? I think yes. When you're looking at your data outcomes and things like that, I think that sometimes you have to be very objective with your data outcomes, and it's really, really important for you to be more objective. Sometimes, with some projects, there's a tendency to put emphasis on one thing and not the other. And your data might show that the emphasis might be misguided. And so that you really need to be a lot more objective with all of the type of data that you're collecting. Um, those outcomes uh, will let you know the successes of your project and your project outcomes much more uh, than just by you looking at it subjectively. I hope that answers your question. Eric, I'm glad to see that you attended last year's meeting. We will be starting new rounds of training in August and September, and uh, I believe you are on our listserv, so you should have announcements coming to you. Uh, this round of training that's happening in August and September is a project planning and development stage, and that's the beginning actually. You, although since you attended last year, you might have already started the type of submission process, or laying out the process in your mind, but it actually happens in August because the actual submission for the applications were in March. So this will allow you enough time to put together your project. Yeah. And as far as review is concerned, um, we like to do the review after the second round of training, which is um, the pre-application training. The reason being is that even though we have standing funding opportunity announcements, sometimes there's slight changes within the funding opportunity announcements that will determine how effective our review of your proposal would be. So that would be in the January uh, time frame. So anytime after that, you can be working all the way up until then, and after you attend the pre-application training, then you can uh, figure out how you can make the tweaks so that it will be reflective of the funding opportunity announcement for this coming year. Okay, since uh, we have one more person typing in, and we'll take that as oh, thank you. Um, I will hand it over to Matt, and he can uh, close it out for us.
All right, thanks, Keone. So in today's webinar, we try to address these goals. By the end of this workshop, you should now be able to start working towards developing short and long-term outcomes that really work for the realistic situations that your organization faces in serving your communities. And you should also be able to prepare for an impact evaluation visit by ANA, and kind of have a feel of what that might be like. So at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about some upcoming webinars. The next one is on conducting a community readiness assessment. which would kind of be, this webinar covers the end part of a project, or like the middle and end. And this community readiness assessment would be something that you could do to be upfront in the planning of a project. And so that will be presented by the ANA Western region. You can find out more on their website, anawestern.org, or you can look at the events page of the ANA website. And on the ANA website, you'll also be able to find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our past webinars, on the resource library section. I'll also be sending out an email after this webinar is done to everyone who registered, and it'll be using the email address that you registered with. In that email, we'll be including the PowerPoint that we used in today's presentation. We'll be including a link to the ANA resource library, which includes a whole bunch of different resources related to today's topics. And we'll also include a link to a survey for you to evaluate how we did today. The survey is really quick, just 1 minute, 3 questions, and it'll also give you a spot where you can type in and suggest topics for future webinars. And so, when we're planning the year's webinars, we look at those topics to decide what to teach. And so if there's something that you really want to learn about, then that survey is the place to put it. And I'll also be linking to that at the end of this webinar. So if you have any more questions, you can contact us. Today's presenter, Keone Nunez, is the Regional Director of the Pacific Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. You can find his email address there on the screen. You're definitely welcome to email him directly, or you can call our office at the number listed there. And we are standing by all summer to help you develop your projects. So Eric, if you need some help developing your project now, there's definitely some things that we can help with. Otherwise, we'll be announcing to our region the upcoming grant period through our email listserv, and as it now stands, through our existing funding announcements, our most popular program, SEDS, Social Economic Development Strategies, will be due on March 4th, 2016, although that date is subject to change. But this is the end of our webinar. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again on a future ANA webinar. Aloha and have a great day.